Hello, and a warm welcome to the eighth episode of our Holcim Awards webinar series, organized in collaboration with EcoGradia. My name is Dr. Priya Pawar, and I am the Holcim Awards manager at the Holcim Foundation. The Holcim Awards have been organized by the foundation since 2004 to support and empower the change accelerators for sustainable construction. Over the past 2 decades, the competition has gathered close to 30,000 entries from 130 countries spanning five geographical regions. The 2023 cycle of the Wholesome Awards received a total of 500 valid submissions, and from these eligible entries, 20 winners were selected by a distinguished panel of jurors. The title of today's webinar is Regenerating Landscapes, Crafting Public Spaces. And I am pleased to see that people from over 44 countries have registered to join this webinar today to share insights on sustainability in their parts of the world are two of our guests. First, Neil Davidson, who is a partner at JNL Gibbons, UK. Their project, Urban Nature Project at the Natural History Museum, won the Holcim Award 2023 Silver Prize for the European region. The second of our today's guests is Carlos Zarcos Sanz. Carlos is a founding partner of Open Act Architecture in Spain. Their project, Co-Stream Habitat in Turkey, won the Holcim Awards 2023 Silver Prize in Middle East and Africa region. Neil, Carlos, would you join me, please?
Hello, Priya.
Hello, Priya. Thank you.
Welcome. Today's session will be hosted by Dr. Nirmal Keshnani, host of EcoGradia podcast, who is a leading author and educator in the field of sustainable design. Nirmal, would you also please join us?
Hi, Priya. Nice to be back.
On behalf of the Wholesome Foundation, we are delighted that you all could be with us today and welcome. Thank you, Nirmal, for hosting today's podcast. Neil, you are presently in London, UK, and Carlos, you are in Madrid, Spain, where it is afternoon. And Nirmal, you're joining us from Singapore, where it is late evening. As the webinar occurs in very different time zones for our host, guest, and audience, we express our appreciation for your enthusiastic participation. Before I go, a word to the audience. There will be a Q&A session at the end of today's conversation. You may type your questions into the comment box. Dr. Kishnani will try to include as many as time permits. Nirmal, I leave the webinar in your good hands and I will see everyone later.
Thank you, Priya. Well, Neil, Carlos, it's a great pleasure to meet you both. Let me start with quotes from the jury panels regarding your respective submissions. Neil, the jury for Europe in awarding the Silver Prize to the Urban Nature Project in the United Kingdom had this to say. The jury particularly applauded the project's dedication to repurposing urban spaces to effectively increase biodiversity and provide new public and recreational areas accessible to all. The project's educational purpose, along with a holistic and integrated design approach, received high praise. The inclusion of outdoor living galleries not only offers opportunities for learning about and exploring nature, but also adds an engaging element to the design. Carlos, the jury for Middle East and Africa, in awarding a silver prize to the Co-Stream Habitat in Turkey, had this to say. The project was recognized for grappling with the challenges posed by rapid urbanization and industrialization. The jurors were deeply struck by the comprehensive and meticulously crafted nature of the project that emerges as a complete ecosystem of regeneration, seamlessly integrating a scheme of revitalization, a dynamic program layout, and a deeply engaged community framework. Before we start the conversation in earnest, please, could you each walk me through your projects? Let's start with you, Neil.
Thank you, Normal. Welcome from London. So the Urban Nature Project reimagines the Natural History Museum's 5-acre garden to increase biodiversity, accessibility, scientific research, and best practice outdoor nature learning all year round. It has been designed as a response to the urgent need to monitor and record changes to the UK's urban nature and develop skills to study in this field, as part of a national drive to re-engage people with the natural world and urban wildlife. The project transforms an underused garden into an urban oasis, creating significant new areas of habitat and biodiversity, and representing the grounds as a living laboratory. A complex project like this has collaboration at its heart. We collaborated closely with architects Field and Fowles on the garden transformation, supported by a multidisciplinary design team that included Gita Geschwentner, engineers HRW, and Max Fordham. Motivated by a commitment to conserve and enhance biodiversity, the design team worked alongside the museum's expert scientists to develop a comprehensive landscape plan featuring accessible outdoor living galleries. These immersive spaces provide numerous opportunities to learn about and explore urban nature and the incredible diversity of life on Earth. Nestled within the landscape are new timber and stone buildings, the Nature Activity Centre supported by Amazon Web Services, and the Garden Kitchen. The Evolution Garden in the East tells the story of deep time through the evolution timeline, supported by the Evolution Education Trust, a journey from deep time to modern day, where visitors can learn about 2.7 billion years of Earth's history, told through an immersive timeline of plants, rocks of different geological periods, and representations of reptiles, birds, dinosaurs, and mammals. A new learning landscape in the West, the Nature Discovery Garden, supported by the Cadogan charity, showcases the broad range of present-day UK habitat types and approaches to climate adaptation set within an urban forest of the future. The Urban Nature Project represents an inspiring case study for repurposing urban spaces to increase biodiversity, provide urban cooling, offering recreational and well-being benefits and enabling scientific research. It is part of a national initiative aimed at inspiring people, and in particular young people, to develop a love of nature and become the naturalists of the future. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Neil. Would you now summarize your project? Carlos.
Sure, Tinma. Thank you very much. It's great to be here with you. So our project Stream Cohabitat is located on the last district on the Asian side of Istanbul, which is called Tuzla. And throughout history, and especially during the Byzantine and Ottoman periods, Tuzla Peninsula had always an identity with its diverse water resources. It was a location for salt production, it was a fishing town and a destination for its healing waters. However, the rapid industrialization and urbanization that happened since the 60s and 70s transformed Tuzla into a major industrial area with shipyards and military barracks. And of course, this unplanned growth has pressured the natural water resources and their connectivity within the entire peninsula. So, working with the local communities and authorities through a series of participatory workshops, events, field trips, meetings, we were able to diagnose all the issues, understand Tuzla's past, and speculate about its future together. And the main design idea focused on mitigating the negative impacts of the 20th century by creating a framework that aims to connect and restore the ecology of the entire peninsula. So, following the routes of the Umur stream in Tuzla, this looping framework generates 7.5 kilometers green corridor connecting different neighborhoods as well as the stream, the lake, and the sea. So it consists of 3 different layers, among which the ecological loop aims habitat restoration, the programmatic loop generates recreational public spaces with amenities, and the circulation loop follows the stream as biking and walking routes, offering alternative modes of mobility for the entire peninsula. Each of these project layers embrace co-design principles to co-create with local community, but also with nature. The plantation becomes the main building block to restore the ecology, but also to create healthy public spaces for the community.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carlos. So let's start with a couple of stats here. Neil, yours is an urban park in the heart of the city of London, some 2 hectares in site. Carlos, yours is a park on the outskirts of the city of Istanbul. It's about 12 times bigger, 25.5 hectares in size. Now, each presents nature in very different ways, but what is common to both is this idea that the social can and should coexist with the ecological. So, integrating the social and the ecological calls for a new mindset to landscape design. Tell me, what does this project achieve that other landscape design projects do not? Carlos.
Well, for us and also for the project, it was all about restoring and creating different ecosystems, right? With the main focus on bringing back this natural water system of the stream the, that is right now currently trapped in a concrete channel, which is a far cry from how it originally shaped Tuzla's landscape somehow. So we are doing this not only to free the stream from that concrete channel, but also reconnecting it with the lake. That connection was cut back in the 80s when the stream was in this concrete channel. So by restoring the aquatic ecosystem, we are laying the foundation for a green ecosystem to flourish around it, which also creates opportunities for a vibrant social ecosystem to emerge in this context. So the social part of the project, the social programming, it revolves completely around community engagement. And we saw this as a main driving factor for us since the very beginning of the project, participatory co-design and creating spaces that foster somehow that social interaction. So the project also integrates these pathways, cycleways, green public spaces with sports programs, and creates this green spine that connects 4 different neighborhoods. And because it passes through many public buildings, also like a municipal library, a local library, there's a social care unit, primary schools. Yeah, it amplifies the accessibility of all this area, creating connectivity for the social infrastructure too. So during the design process, we wanted to ensure that the local community was actively involved in the design implementation to be able to reinforce somehow the social ties and promote a collective stewardship of the environment. Each time we visit the site, and it's incredible to see that people are coming to us and telling us things about the growing rosemary, the plantation, and how they love cooking it or using it for the kitchen, or some kids getting angry with the littering adults that are in the park. So it really highlights this deep connection that they have developed with the space. So, well, just to answer your question about this integration, I think all these layers that I'm talking about exist here, and once we superpose all these layers on top of each other, we notice that they do not only complement each other, but they complete each other in making the picture complete somehow.
I think it's very interesting what you said at the beginning, that water is key. It's kind of a restoration of water systems that brings life back into a landscape, and then makes all these other things possible. Neil, water was not central to what was done in your project, but what what would you say set it apart from other urban landscape projects in London?
Um, yeah, well, I mean, funnily enough, water is a subtle part of our project. Not a single drop of rain that hits the ground in our project goes into a drain. It all goes back into the landscape from the buildings and from the landscape itself, and that helped inform the way we planted the gardens. Really, we've been very careful to use the resources sensitively, whether that was working with the soil on site or with the water that comes from the sky, which it does quite a lot in the UK. But one of the things in terms of sort of the social challenge, I suppose, is that the Natural History Museum is the second most visited cultural institution in the UK. So since we reopened the gardens a month and a half ago, there's 27,000 people a day visit the gardens. So in a small space, that's a sort of an intensity of use that's quite unique, I think. But it provides so many opportunities to reconnect people with nature in a very urban location. Um, and much like Carlos was explaining, this kind of multi-layered approach allows, or gave us the opportunity to provide explicit learning experiences by being in the gardens, learning about Earth's history and how plants didn't emerge until a particular moment in time, but then also being much more subtle. So um, there are very there's stories to be told throughout the whole landscape that are facilitated by museum staff. So they take young groups of children, for example, into the pond environment. They have activities where they learn to pond dip. They then examine the creatures they find in the ponds. Um, the museum's so lucky; they have some of the world's foremost experts in particular um, creatures such as moths. Three moths that are unique to science have been discovered in these gardens. So it kind of, when you have those expert eyes, you've got to make the most of it, don't you? You've got to sort of try and encourage young people to get excited about this, the potential to be involved in working in the environment and tackling, these challenges we have in terms of biodiversity and climate emergencies. And young people are enthusiastic about that. That's what we find anyway. It's been a really satisfying project to work on in that respect.
Mm. I mean, I think the conversation on socio-ecological systems, where we bring the social and the ecological together, often presents itself as being perfectly symbiotic. But there are tensions, are there not? I mean, there are moments where the two things are at odds with each other. I'm just curious, like in the course of your design process, was there a moment where you had to decide one over the other? Neil?
I mean, when we're talking about that number of people on a daily basis, that is definitely something you have to factor into design. It has to be beautiful, but it has to be incredibly robust. And we are collectively learning with the museum that certain use patterns that we anticipated perhaps are not how it's being used. So we're having to slightly modify things, but that's fine because that's the wonder of landscape and gardens, is that they evolve and you can modify them, and hopefully they get better with time rather than being a kind of complete set piece on day one. But really, I mean, I think a lot of the work that we do working in landscapes is about finding balance. And something that was particularly interesting about this project is we worked through the whole COVID pandemic. And so engagement was different. It was virtual. But also, we've learned that people's relationship to nature and open space is different post-pandemic. So you have to think about how you provide really fully social spaces where lots of people can gather together, but you also have to provide places where people can be, in a more intimate setting on their own, not surrounded by people, because our kind of relationship to nature and how it impacts our health and well-being is really profound. And that's something we tried to incorporate into the project. So that's where we moved away from maybe practices that we would have used post 2020, and thought about that in terms of the design that we delivered.
I mean, would it be fair to say that the project was closer to a garden than an ecosystem?
In part, because when you're designing a garden or an ecosystem that is 350 million years old, a lot of those plants don't exist anymore. So we have worked very closely with scientists in the museum to find very, very distant relatives of the plants that were around before dinosaurs existed, for example. And so in that sense, it has a biodiversity value, but it's not a true ecosystem in that sense. But wherever we can, we've tried to create experiences that are coherent. So a sense of what that would have looked like in terms of the plant use. So we've been very, very precise. The museum has had to consider what it would be like if their contemporaries from another museum, a natural history museum from around the globe, came to visit and said, "Hang on a second, that plant is in the wrong part of your timeline," or flowers didn't exist until the Cretaceous period and beyond. So why is that there? So it's in that sense, part of the garden is kind of is a bit of scenography to tell that story. But the other part, the western side, is proper ecosystems. So it is ecosystems that are rare in cities like wetlands, we have a really thriving, we did this very careful piece of translocation. So we took a small pond, we took all of the water, the plants, the sediments, and the flora and fauna, and we put them into a temporary home for 6 months, and then we brought them back to the new larger ponds. And so we have an instantly thriving ecosystem in that respect. All of the scientists are very happy about how quickly it's become very healthy again. So it's in instant study in terms of children's activities, but instant study in terms of the scientists looking at how you can translocate habitats very carefully and then put them back.
Carlos, yeah, the project in Istanbul was all ecosystem, was it not? And I mean, in the sense that it really is a constructed ecosystem where you are trying to create food chains and hydrological flows, and um, it, was there conflict between people and ecosystem?
I mean, in our particular experience, I know that this topic it exists, but in this particular project, we didn't encounter any conflict toward nature coming from any of the sites that the project was bringing, nor from the community, nor from the official bodies that the project, that the client in this case. So on the contrary, people were really eager uh, to attain for more natural spaces. Like they were living in a space that they felt like it was a concrete jungle, surrounded by asphalt, concrete, and they were deeply aware of the lack of green space. So they long for this more natural environment. So both for themselves and for their children. So I remember during our early visits to the site, residents frequently complain about the conditions around the concrete stream channel. Mosquitoes, for example, the unpleasant smell that this generates. These ecosystems are completely broken down, and the overall unnatural state of the stream. So they understood that this wasn't how a stream should be. Some of them, they even remember how it was before it was channeled, and they were fully aware of that the natural balance was disrupted completely, and they wanted it restored somehow. So rather than dealing with this fear of nature, our challenge was navigating the conflicts that they always exist in a project in between economic, political, and environmental interests somehow. So I'm saying this because the stream was originally channeled into concrete due to the unplanned growth that the city had, with industries using it as sewage and unregulated housing springing around it. So these decisions were later legitimized because of political reasons, which complicated our efforts to restore the area. And the real conflict lies somehow in this tug of war, no? In between short-term gains and long-term environmental sustainability. So not because of any fear itself. So this conflict actually continues to shape the project today, and making some of the phases of it really complicated for us to achieve, and even putting certain parts of it at risk of cancellation somehow. So due to these conflicts.
I'm curious because you mentioned conflicts of a political nature, like informal settlements. Actually, in my part of the world as well, so many river streams are saturated with informal settlements, where the rivers become sewers and they become a kind of support system that the infrastructure does not provide. How was this resolved? I'd like to know. It is inherently a tension between what exists and what you were striving for.
Yes. So in our case, I'm speaking about the project in Tuzla. The spaces are officially managed by several bodies. You can guess, like there is Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality, there's a local municipality of the peninsula of Tuzla, there is the Istanbul Water Administration, particularly because there is a stream that they handle the routine operations and the maintenance of these spaces with their annual budgets, but while these entities are crucial for the management of the place, the heart of the project, in our case, it was the ecological design principles somehow. So for a start, our approach is been to restore nature's own abilities to self-sustain, self-maintain, and self-regulate. So we use 98% of local and native plant species because those are the plants that thrive naturally in the area and that they don't require additional irrigation or any intensive maintenance. So that significantly cuts down the costs and the resource use. And we also address the water management issues by reworking the rainwater infrastructure into the stream. And we introduce bioswales, rain gardens, also water deposit tanks to capture the storm runoff effectively. And this not only supports the stream, but also ensures that the landscape remains somehow resilient to and without minimal human intervention. So for us it's equally important, if not more, is the role of the community that the community plays in this. So from the very beginning we were very deeply engaged in the project, and they really helped guide the decisions from the very beginning. They even decided the placement of various sports programs and different features of the project. So now, for example, that there's a small part of the first phase is really open, and you continue seeing them involved, and they actively monitor the space. So in essence, the official bodies, somehow they are the ones that are managing the space on paper, but it's the combination of that ecological design with the active community involvement that I think it helps to navigate all these conflicts, and altogether you make like a common force.
Right,
Somehow.
right.
I mean, isn't it? Sorry, Nirmal, if it just to say, because I think this idea of ecosystems and sort of people, kind of the tension there. One thing we've learned on this project and others is that in real urban locations, some young people have never seen wildlife, never had that connection with nature. It's such a fundamental um, disconnect with natural processes, and it's such an important thing to try and tackle and engage. And landscapes evolve, don't they? And throughout the year, it will look different, it will be different, and you kind of understand the process. And that feels like such an important thing to be doing in urban locations, to try and kind of talk about that.
Describe the design process, Neil. I mean, I'm curious as to how a project like this begins and what are the stages of it. For example, who was the voice of biodiversity at the drawing board? I mean, who spoke for flora and fauna?
Well, we were really lucky. We had an amazing client, and several sort of scientists who work very closely with the design team. So in that respect, we were co-designing with scientists. As I mentioned earlier, we had to be scientifically robust in what we were doing. But also, the Natural History Museum is also the home to the Angela Marmot Centre, which is the UK Centre for Biodiversity. So we have some of the top ecological minds probably in the world located on our doorstep, and we were given access to those people. So whilst we work with biodiversity in all of our projects, we were engaging with certain plant groups that we just don't design with normally. I mean, we don't design gardens just to put a 25-meter long bronze dinosaur in, for example, on an everyday basis. So, we had the benefit of that very specific, huge wealth of knowledge. But then obviously we had to try and make it coherent as a whole. So that, I guess, that's the challenge for the designers, in consultation with our stakeholders and a whole wealth of external stakeholders. The London Wildlife Trust, for example, were a partner who gave some seed for one of our meadow areas. So we have this kind of network of nature in London, but we have a network of nature across the United Kingdom as well. The museum has eight other institutions that it's partnered with, for example. And at the same time, we were always conscious that what we were doing in this site should have a value across the United Kingdom, or could have some benefit to maybe somebody in their own home environment, whether they maybe created a window box that was a diverse piece of habitat, or they were lucky to have a garden in London, because not many people do. They could do something in their own garden, or a school, or so that there's a very comprehensive toolkit that the museum has developed to allow people to expand the urban nature experience, which I think has been really fascinating for us. We don't get that opportunity very often.
What about you, Carlos? I mean, who was at the table in a project like this that normally isn't?
Well, like I was mentioning before, there are like the normal stakeholders, like the bodies, the public bodies that deal with this kind of construction of the parks. But when I was thinking about in Neil's question, like the voice of nature is really something that we question ourselves to a lot in the office, because of course that I completely agree that there is this our ecological design principles, landscape architects, urban planners, forest engineers, environmental engineers, they are key to technically address and to create and integrate the green infrastructure into the urban environment. And together with them, you design things like bioswales, rain gardens, all this kind of systems that do not only support biodiversity, but they also create habitats for native species to thrive. So it's all about making these local ecosystems thrive, I think, while being functional with the public space. But we added, like, and in we work in a lot of our projects with participatory design. I think we find this a key element, and a second part to achieve this part of the voice of nature. So the local community, those who actually live there and interact with the space on a day-to-day basis, they are the ones that should be actively involved with the project too. So this approach somehow ensures that the ecological needs are met by the technical team somehow, but they are not only technically addressed, but they are woven into the culture and into the social fabric of the community. So it's true that this arises conflict sometimes, and really long collaboration sessions in some cases, but everyone involved in that table, it's a voice of nature somehow. So
Right.
and they are helping maintain the ecological integrity of the project.
No, I'll come back to the participatory design question in a minute because I think that's a really interesting aspect of what you've done. But I do want to understand in a project like this, how do you know when you're there, right? There is a there. You're working towards an outcome, and I know that landscape architects some talk about ecosystem services, and the measurement of ecosystem services is a way of evaluating how successful a constructed ecosystem is. So, if you can, for instance, assess a garden or a park in terms of the ecosystem services it provides, whether it's the cleaning of water or the cleaning of air, then that gives you a metric against which you can benchmark it. So, was this part of the conversation for either of you? Starting with you, Carlos.
I mean, of course, when you are from the very beginning of the project, what you have certain goals of sustainability, but they're somehow embedded into our design capabilities. Like you, of course, you're going to deal with the rainwater system. You're going to try to bring, and that will be the start of the project. So we see things like not one goes after separate from the other, but we see them in line somehow. So when you um, restorate and restore the water systems of the stream, that will bring back somehow the natural ecosystems to the site. And then when it's bringing back the natural ecosystems to the site and the natural ecology to the site, we see opportunities in injecting somehow, some social services around the site. So how do we measure or do we measure success in that sense you were mentioning? Like it's a combination of all of them somehow. If we will measure the water has to be in place, the ecology has to be in place, and the social interaction part, like how are people, are people really using the space? Are they okay with with the spaces that we generated for them, and they're going to be the ones using there? So I think how we measure success in that sense is a combination of all these parts of the project together.
Sure. Neil, I know that your project had a very strong social educational agenda, and we will get to that in a minute. I just want to know, with all the scientists that you had at your disposal, was there a science to this idea of ecosystem services. Yeah.
Yeah.
Whether there was a metric, a way of understanding outcome.
So there's two ways of answering this. I guess there's the project, because metrics are very useful, but they're also can be quite binary, I suppose, in the way that they're applied. Um,
Mm.
And we had a challenge in this project because half of the site you can apply the usual metrics. Are the indigenous plants? Are you diversifying species range? And on the other half of the project, we have plants that are not indigenous, or maybe to phrase it slightly differently, were indigenous tens of millions of years ago. So, for example, we have one part of the garden that is a where scientists have analysed pollen in the clay of London's ground and found seeds from tropical London when London was a tropical city. So before humans, about 21 million years ago, and a bit beyond that.
Wow.
So we've reused those plants in the setting to tell that story of radically evolving climate change, um, and but that doesn't comply with the metrics. It doesn't fit into the metric categories. So we had a very good, productive conversation with the local authority who assessed that, and we presented a case that was abnormal, I suppose, in the way that you measure biodiversity gain across the site. And in other areas, it was much more simple. Like we created a pond that was 60% larger wetland area, larger surface area. But the really interesting bit, in my view, is what happens from now on. So within the framework of our landscape, we have a roughly a 20-meter grid of scientific monitoring points, and these are power and data locations where scientists from the museum can go out into these diverse habitats and gardens, and they can measure environmental change, positive and negative. They can they've been pioneering a piece of work around environmental DNA, where they look at the soil, they examine the type of microbes in the soil. They then extrapolate that to determine how healthy the habitats are. And we acknowledge in this project that there'll be some areas that are experiments and will change, and things will thrive, and some things won't. Um, and very deliberately. So the very deliberately this is because as we kind of talked about earlier, it's a living laboratory. It's a place to study environmental change, and it might in time inform slightly different metrics for how you do that in an urban location, because we think this is probably going to be the most studied piece of urban landscape probably in the world, because of the people who are on the doorstep and the size of it. So yeah, really exciting potential, but maybe we'll have to do another webinar in a few years' time to feedback the results, Normal.
You're on. we'll get Holcim on board again. But I still want to ask the question of how do we know what the there is, and okay, maybe not in ecosystem services or the health of the ecology, but what were the performance targets? I mean, did you set up very specific targets that you were working towards? And I take your point, Neil, that with gardens and landscapes, it's not like designing a building and saying I'm gonna achieve 60% energy efficiency. It's not as simple as that. But if it's not, then what is it? What? How do you know you're on the right track? I mean, um, I noticed that both of your projects talk a lot about carbon as a goal, but you do it in very different ways. And I'm curious to know if that was a thing that was decided at the very beginning, or was it something that you kind of did measurements as you went along?
Yeah.
Carlos, talk me through the targets that you had, maybe specifically carbon and the strategy for that.
I mean, it's true. I completely agree with you that when we are speaking about landscape projects, it's really hard to measure. But on the other hand, I think it's for us, it was all about reconnecting people with nature, and how do you really measure? Like it's not something that you can put a target to it and hit it. So it, we've thought from the beginning this can lead for a deeper appreciation of the environment, no? And it will create more sustainable habits of the people that are living there too. So when you bring nature into the city, it naturally it naturally encourages things like walking, for example, or cycling, or even community gardening somehow. So when you give access to people of these spaces, these activities are great for both physical health and social connections. It's true that there's no measurement, like I don't have a technologic device to measure these things, but our look to how are people reacting. So that's why we find this participatory co-design like a feedback mechanism too, that we are testing if the solutions that we are bringing to the table have a positive or a negative reaction, or are they working better or worse than that. So that's a little bit our technological device to somehow measure the carbon footprint in a way of the project.
But you did specifically state in the report that the project will be carbon negative in 10 years or something to that effect, right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
that
Because
can't have been purely a question of participatory
sure.
design of people. So what was that based on?
Yeah, technically, so the main idea of the project is turning asphalt roads into green spaces. So right now the stream is completely followed by car roads that they are not really used, like they are more used like parking spaces for the citizens. So that's where we can really measure how do we, if we shift from an asphalt and a concrete surface to a green space, what is the carbon effect that has in the city, and Istanbul has this contrast that the upper part of the city, the northern part of the city, is the most green part of Istanbul, and the south of Istanbul is the one that is urban, densely populated, and actually the green is not able to penetrate through. So using the opportunity of these streams that they were natural at some point, and they became like that. So that's what we can actually measure with numbers. How do we flip this amount of surface of asphalt roads into lush green space with social amenities and into so like
And carbon sequestration. I mean, that
yeah.
must have been a key part of it. Neil, what about your carbon targets? I mean,
Yeah,
you speak of carbon as well. I'm
yeah,
wondering
yeah.
how that was
So,
framed.
one of the consultants on the project are construction organization called Mace, who they work alongside the design team developing a carbon calculator effectively as we went through the various design stages, with targets at each design stage to improve on the carbon footprint of different materials. So we were fortunate enough to have a bit of time to prototype with various surfaces. Obviously, the obvious one is talking when we kind of thinking about where's our materials coming from, and we have this quite unusual situation in the UK where it has incredibly diverse geology. The stone types are very radically different from north to south of the country, with some really, really unique stone in the northwest of Scotland, which is more closely related to Canada and Greenland than it is to England.
Hmm.
So in those cases, those stones are not coming necessarily from working quarries. So we effectively negotiated with landowners um, to let us have the materials from their land. And that meant that we didn't have to import materials from all around the world to tell this story. We're able to, through a process of negotiation, I guess, um, keep our kind of our material sourcing quite in a country size sense, local.
Mm.
And I think that's been interesting because we've done that through both the buildings and the architecture on the project. We have been able to um, get to a point where we are carbon neutral. And one of the challenges we had in the UK, because we've got lots of different metrics you can apply to a building project in the UK to measure sustainability. And they all tend to fall a bit short when it comes to landscape. Is that we were able to kind of define a slightly a bespoke way of measuring, I guess. It sounds a bit like what Carlos has done as well, because we didn't find any of these off-the-shelf products necessarily work for us. And that was challenging for the local authority because they were saying, right, what we want you to do is carbon offset offsite. And we're saying, well, no, we want to do it on site. And it's because they're just used to projects coming forward, and the default position is we'll solve this problem somewhere else on the other side of the world, rather than trying really hard to do it on the site you have. So I think we were quite successful in that aspect, and we did innovate in some areas. So the construction process, there was no diesel used on site. It was all either electric or biofuel, and we had some quite innovative pieces of kit. We had the largest electric crane in the UK, which was used to lift the frame in for the buildings. And what that sort of highlights, I guess, is that the technology needs to rapidly catch up with the aspirations of the projects, because the batteries need to last a bit longer to make that a kind of something that everyone can use on all their projects. Whereas the Natural History Museum were accepting that it might take a little bit longer to build something by doing it in a way that could be an example for others. um, which is kind of interesting. So we did talk about maybe hydrogen powered vehicles for certain things as well, but that I think the technology is not quite there yet for doing that in a city centre. So yeah, I think it's I think we've been. I think there has been some kind of real innovation. I think also, I mean, I've said before about this project, the real test is what it's like in generations to come. This really has to be a project that um, that thrives, that evolves, it gets better, and because otherwise you see these a lot of projects these days which have quite good sustainable credentials, but really have to be updated or replaced. So when it came to kind of, for example, the how we use power on or energy on site, the national grid in the UK very soon will be carbon neutral. So the greenest form of energy in the UK will be electric. So that's kind of, we're trying to future proof. We're not, there's no kind of add on kind of features. It's very much integrated into the whole project infrastructure, which has been interesting, an interesting process to go through.
Are you documenting this? I think we're sort of getting past the broad description of the project into some of the nitty gritty of community or carbon. Is this documented somewhere? Is it accessible to the public?
It's definitely documented, and I'm not sure what the aspirations of the museum are to make it public, but generally they make things public. That's kind of their reason, I suppose, is not to to do research and then to share knowledge and hope that other people adopt those, or kind of enhance what they've done. So yeah, I'm not sure, but I would really think that's something they will want to publish. Yeah.
What about you, Carlos? Is your project the design thinking and the process and the outcomes, is that available publicly?
I mean, we work closely with the Istanbul Planning Agency. That actually it was the organ, like the body that helped us with this measurements of community engagement and this kind of carbon footprint. So they have the documentation, and I think it's available to public. It's not of my knowledge right now if it's right now online something you can access, but they definitely have it on their hands.
Well, I hope so. I think the things that you've both talked about are really interesting, and to your point, Neil, that these metrics and these conversations are commonly heard in buildings, but not so often in landscapes. So I think it's a really really valuable lessons learned and outcomes. I'm going to move on to the Q&A, and I'm going to kick it off by asking a question, which I ask all guests in the webinar, which is, if you had a choice, what would you have done differently? Carlos.
Okay, that's a question that I think I I would have done. Basically, we would have done probably basically most of it the same, and we are really happy with the outcome of the project because it showed us something that we had the theory that it will work like that. There is all this participatory design that I'm always speaking about, but we are really proud of that part of the project because um, as one of the big moments of this entire process was, for example, we hit some roadblocks. with the permits. When there are this many bodies, they are managing all these political interests with different settings. I think sometimes what is most complicated is to pass through all this and to somehow have a voice still, in the project. So working this close with the community, we were able to somehow pass through that. Like it was like a great tool also for not only for the design of the project, but also to go through the phases. So it's just not like a nice to have somehow. Like it taught us that it's crucial, and it's something that we need to add more in all our projects, because the local community engagement shape the design and help us somehow pass through by showing the political decision makers that what the community really wants and needs. So I don't know if will do anything differently, but I will definitely keep that in the project.
Neil, what
Um,
would you do differently?
I'm sorry, I'm going to give you a boring, similar answer because, I mean, I genuinely mean this. This has, for us, it's been the project of a lifetime to work on because it's reinvigorated some boyhood loves that I had about geology and things, and we've been able to learn ourselves as designers on this project. We've been able to innovate, and I suppose that comes from having a client who has an aspiration that aligns with the design team, and that's not always the case. So the fact that we've had an exceptional client has allowed us to pretty much push the boundaries wherever we could in terms of the landscape design of the urban nature project. I think the thing that I would like to I'm sort of setting this up for another webinar here, but is the kind of point where, again, it's give the project time and see how it evolves and thrives and how it influences. And that's where you might find that there's something that, in retrospect, we might have done something differently, because what this project is most definitely about is more than it's 5 acres. It's about inspiring, kind of, you know internationally being an inspiring place to learn, and hopefully then, that then translates into young people going to university to learn to be landscape architects, environmentalists, whatever, take a real interest in the planet, because we need people with that enthusiasm going into that kind of um, world of learning, really.
Mm.
So yeah, if you ask me in a few more years' time, Nirmal.
Yeah. Oh, we'll have to set a date for that. I have a couple of questions here from Ellie Hazael. I think I'm saying it right. She says to Neil, this is to you, directed to you. What challenges did you face working with the local authority?
Um, the main challenge was we went through that whole process during the pandemic. So all of our engagement with them was in a very similar setting to what we have now. It was on computers, virtually talking about the project. Um, but I think the fact that the local authority has a very long-standing relationship with the Natural History Museum helped. The museum's been there for 140 years nearly, um, and and it's really kind of, we were able to, in some cases, help them with some of their initiatives. For example, we have a climate change garden at the very end of the kind of timeline, which is speculating on what London will be like in 2050. So a much warmer, drier climate, more similar to where Carlos is. And they were saying, well, that's interesting to us because that's a kind of an exemplar we can use for those who are planting trees into streets or into developments in the city. We can say, I mean, what can we do with not, impoverished soils, quite hard landscapes are going to reflect heat. How do we kind of so actually it became a kind of really positive relationship. It was very refreshing to have that in this case.
Mm. Oh, excellent. This one's for you, Carlos, from Dipisha R. She says, Carlos, how would you approach stream cohabitat reimagined in a dry and arid climate condition where water is only available for 2 to 3 months of the year?
Whoa. That's a project by itself, like, I mean, there are really arid places in the world where water is still the source of life, no, somehow. So I think what I will do is try to find a way of somehow um, collect that, whatever it is that amount of whatever, because that is what is allowing you later to bring the plantation back, and whatever is coming behind that. So I understand that maybe it could be from different, maybe there's different technologies in different places. I will have to look into it, but that will be I mean, actually, that's part of the that's that was part of our aim, that this can be a system that, of course, dealing with different climates and different environments, somehow it can be replicated. It can spark some ideas all over the world, and make people somehow rethink also how is their close urban environment, and are they happy with it? Is there something that we should do about? So just the fact that there's that question, I'm happy about it, because it's sparking that in a
Mm.
way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
Um, I Elie Hazel has another question for you, Neil, but I think it could equally apply to Carlos. Um, and this is that what parts specifically have been modified as a result of human behavior? I know that the Natural History Museum, the garden, has been open for a few months now, so there might be some evidence of the exchange between the people in that environment. And Carlos, I'm not sure how much of your park is open or it's still under construction.
It's under construction still, but there's a small part.
Okay, so I'm wondering, what to paraphrase Ellie's question, um, the the interaction between people and the environment. To what extent is this design receptive to that that
Yeah.
exchange?
So I think the thing we're looking at really is how we um, engage with the visitors in a way that is, because this is the funny a funny situation is where sometimes people don't know how delicate nature is,
Mm,
or indeed if they're allowed to interact with it. Um, so it's really just having people out there talking about why things are what they are. Why things are like what they are. So we have some very definite kind of interactions happening in the pond to facilitate that kind of the activities there. But we're also looking at activities which are based around the things that are not so, maybe not so interesting on the surface, but how you look after a landscape, how you do how you put more compost into the ground, how you think about how you generate compost from the landscape. All these activities that are kind of are fundamental for long-term success of the project. So those things are starting to happen as I mean, it's a new garden and it's growing, and those things will happen and evolve, and they will all be very seasonal as well. This is the thing. We opened right in the middle of the summer when the school holidays were in full flow. So we had this huge influx of people in the warmest time, the driest time, when all of the plants had just kind of gone in. So next spring, those plants are probably, in a few weeks' time, they'll be like, thank goodness it's a bit less busy and we can kind of just settle in a little bit more. Um, so it's kind of, I suppose that's the thing, is we've just had to sort of adjust to the timings of things, and in any
mm,
landscape you have to adjust to the variations you get in climate.
mm,
We've not had any rain in London for, I mean, any substantial rain for probably since May, really. Um,
mm,
so it's kind of, we need some rain here. I was just in the north of in the UK last week. There was lots of rain there. We just needed to come down south a little bit. But it's kind of, yeah, it's a thing. Landscapes are dynamic, so you have to kind of observe, and that's why there's a head gardener and a team that will be working in the gardens. There's a whole host of volunteers who will be participating in the care or the caretaking of the landscape. And I think once those people are out doing their things, then they can talk to the public and explain why that plant is doesn't have any leaves on it this time of year, because that's normal. It's quite basic
mhm.
stuff.
Right. Carlos, what
I,
about
I
your
I mean,
park?
for us, yeah, I was remembering, like, the engagement of people in the park like started even before the construction started. But when the construction started, it was even like right now there are excavators and machinery, and everything is like still a mess. It's not. There's a small part that is open, but the rest is open. So people, the day that we broke ground, they were already using the park somehow. They already were engaged with it. They already knew what plantation was going where somehow. So there is that engagement that was prepared from the design phase. So the moment that the project started, that engagement just exploded, and it's really necessary because you can imagine in a city like Istanbul that has almost 20 million inhabitants. Like if I don't remember wrong, in the entire area of Tuzla, they only had measured, the municipality had this measure that there was only 3 square meters per person of green spaces. So that's way below the amount of green space that they have. So they just embrace the project from the very beginning and engage with it in a way that we were not expecting. So that's one of the things that we are really enjoying in this part of the process right now somehow. So they come, they have suggestions. Okay, here this is, but there's also this sort of stewardship over that. It's a little bit what Neil was mentioning too, that it's really necessary for any project to have a long-term life and sustainable, resilient life somehow, to have that, and because they are the ones that are going to take care of it in the future. So that's key too.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you both. I really enjoyed the time that we've spent. I mean, unfortunately, that's all the time we have today, and it's been a great pleasure. At this point, I'd like to invite Priya back to the stage for some closing remarks.
Hi, we all have already exhausted the time we have, so I'm not going to have any closing remarks other than the fact that I must thank all of you for the wonderful conversation that you've had and allowed our audience to benefit from it. So, on behalf of the foundation and the audience, I'm going to take the opportunity to thank you all for this. And for the audience, I'd like to say that we have our next webinar on October 1st, where we will have our Latin American winners from Colombia and Ecuador joining us. The webinar will be in Spanish, so please do join us and don't forget to bring a friend.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very
Thank
much.
Thank you
you.
very much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.